Good morning, everybody. We're now going to start the webinar, Planning for Life After School. You're all very welcome today. Carol, I'd ask you to unmute your microphone. Thank you very much. So welcome everyone to today's webinar in our family leadership series, Planning for Life After School. My name is Rachel Casson, and I will be your host for this webinar. I'm a parent and the director and co-founder of LEAP. For those of you who are new to LEAP, LEAP is a small family-led organization that supports families to take action for an inclusive life. LEAP webinars, and this is number 7, I think, of a webinar series we've been running since October. Our webinars address topics important to families who are pursuing an inclusive life for their son or daughter, brother or sister with a disability. Today's webinar features Carol Lloyd, a parent from Dublin who has used individualized funding paired with a vision of a good life to support her daughter Emily. Carol will talk about the family's journey from their daughter's last years in school to the present day, and how the family knew that existing post-school options were not what they or their daughter wanted. The presentation will also cover how the family set their sights on inclusion and worked on creating a vision for the future that inspired them to action. We will hear about how they set up a circle of support to bring together family and friends to support that vision. Carol will also talk about the fear she experienced and how it was really important to connect with others on a similar path, bringing together people who believed in what the family were trying to accomplish. You will all have opportunities to ask questions, and a list of resources to support planning for the future will be available afterwards to all participants. The frightening truth is that hundreds of young people graduate from school to the couch, to unemployment, to boredom, and to loneliness. There is no magical solution, but if we as families start early, build relationships, and plan for a full life in the community with peers, we can often avoid that predictable disaster. So I'm really pleased to introduce Carol Lloyd, who will give the presentation today. Carol will share her family's story of planning for life after school, of pursuing post-school options that did not exist, and of realizing that it was up to them as a family to create a life with and for their daughter Emily. I think I can safely say that the journey the family has gone on in the last few years has put Emily on a pathway that no one imagined at the beginning. So while Carol begins to share her screen, I want to draw your attention to the chat function at the bottom of your screens. Please use this function to say hello and maybe where you're joining from today, and also to put your comments or questions in the chat function too. As I mentioned earlier, there will be lots of time at the end of Carol's presentation, for questions and answers. And for those of you who haven't been on a webinar before, please be assured that you cannot be seen or heard by others. Carol, thank you, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Rachel, for inviting me here today. I'm very happy to be here. As you know, I'm Carol. I live in Stepaside with my husband, Edward, and our daughter, Emily. I am originally from Tullamore. I studied marketing in Dublin and worked in the drinks industry for many years. I enjoy Pilates, walking, and I love my glass of wine at the weekends. Just like to let you all know that Emily has given me permission to do this presentation. and I have included several photos. They're all there to highlight specific points, as opposed to just showing our family pics. I think the most important message that I want to share today is not so much what we've been doing, but the importance of changing our mindsets. This has allowed us to overcome obstacles that weren't actually obstacles, and also opened a whole new world of opportunity for our daughter. Our presentation today is divided into 5 areas: context and historical perspective from when we lived in the States, navigating the Irish system when we moved back to Ireland, research into Emily's future and learning highlights, a new journey, and finally, life after school begins. Context and historical perspective. I think a little bit of background is important, as the early years had a huge influence on Emily's entire life. I also think it's helpful for you to know what our challenges were. Emily was born in Florida. She suffered significant brain injuries at birth, which resulted in profound physical disabilities. Emily is 100% dependent on others and does not walk, talk, or eat by mouth. Regarding her personality, I think all will be revealed within this presentation. From the very beginning, Emily had lots of early interventions from physio, OT, and speech and language. Everyone was very incredibly motivated to do their absolute best for our little girl. Our experience was very positive. The focus was always on achieving the highest goals possible. All disciplines worked to give us the best tools to help Emily. They were also pretty clear about the downside of not taking their advice. This was very important, that we were well informed. We knew exactly what was involved to keep Emily as well as possible. Here are examples of the can-do attitude and the positive mindset of people in our lives. Nothing was too much trouble. One example I love is when Emily was 3, her physio came in one day and asked, "Why doesn't Emily have a bicycle?" I thought she was crazy. How could Emily ride a bike if she can't sit, walk, or stand? The physio gave me a number of a guy in Miami who had a bike shop, and he had adapted a bike for his own son who had disabilities. I rang him, and he asked if Emily could bear any weight on her legs. I said she could a little. He said, "Bring her down. I guarantee you I'll have her riding around in 30 minutes. And sure enough, he did. Emily was thrilled, and it was great to see her able to enjoy age-appropriate activities. Navigating the Irish system. We moved back to Ireland in 2006. We were very excited to come home and have Emily grow up with her cousins and our friends' children. Emily happily settled into her new school, Enable Ireland in Sandymount. We needed a facility with on-site nurses, therapists, and ceiling hoist facilities. Medical needs were very complex. The change in coming back to Ireland was enormous for me. I was absolutely delighted to be home, but the challenges were almost too much. I no longer had any control over Emily's education, her therapies, or medical interventions. Decisions were made by others, people who didn't know or understand Emily's needs. These decisions were harmful to Emily in all of the above mentioned areas. I found the mindset was very closed and years behind the States, at least 20 years in terms of physio, and that's a fact. It was black and white, coming from a place with a very can-do attitude to a place where everything I believed in was now considered by others not to be in Emily's best interests. It was scary. As Emily entered teenage years, I knew for sure I had lost the education battle. If anything, the children were being taught less and less as the years went by. I worried about the lack of stimulation for Emily and about the impact of learning the same stuff since she was 4 years old, year after year. The curriculum didn't stretch her imagination at all. I started to hear people say, if you think it's bad now, wait until she's an adult. Research phase. When Emily turned 16, I started to look at the options for after school. I had a knot in the bottom of my stomach thinking about her future. I knew Emily had had a happy childhood despite all her medical issues. However, for the first time in her life, I felt I wasn't going to have control over her future happiness and quality of life. I felt it was in the hands of others who would decide if my child would even be offered an adult day service or not. If so, would it be for 2 days a week or 4 days a week? And would it even meet any of Emily's needs? I had frequently seen adult service users outside shops in Dundrum in their wheelchairs, doing nothing, while carers took it in turn to go into shops. That used to kill me, and it would have killed Emily. It didn't take long for me to understand that a day service, in my opinion, could not have the means to discover Emily's interests, her strengths or potential, nor would they have the means to fulfill them. I had learned during this time the importance of setting high expectations for Emily. Too many people set the bar too low. I didn't want to be one of those people. At that point, one of the managers of a service I was looking at forwarded me information on a conference that was coming up. She said this might be more in line with what I was looking for. The conference was about planning for a good life and was run by Marge and Jeremy Ward, parents from Australia invited to Ireland to share their story. I registered and will forever be thankful that I did. I always thought it was very significant that a manager from a service was pointing me in a direction that was exactly the opposite of what their service offered. That first conference blew my mind. I was shocked and overwhelmed at the amount of work involved to provide Emily a good life. It seemed like a massive task, but immediately I felt some relief in the pit of my stomach. There were real options for developing a good life for Emily. I started to get connected to lots of new people and agencies such as LEAP. All were passionate about creating a good life for our children. Those conferences and workshops changed everything for us. I learned so much. It was hard to believe that I had not truly understood the meaning of an inclusive life. My mindset before now had seen obstacles that were only in my head. If I, who wanted the best for our daughter, could not see the opportunities, how could I expect anyone else to, especially a service? I became convinced that a mainstream or typical path, the same as the rest of us, was the only option for Emily. I was terrified, but we had to take this path. I took comfort in the 60 years of research evidence proving much better outcomes from a typical path in life versus a segregated day service. And it's a good thing we were not looking for a service. As it turned out, there was none for Emily. Her needs were apparently too complex. A new journey. Thanks to LEAP's incredible and incessant encouragement and help, our circle of support got up and running. This circle was made up of a group of people who really cared for Emily, family members, neighbours, friends, all sitting around a kitchen table, having regular meetings every month. Our first meeting took steps at developing a vision for Emily. This was daunting, but very exciting. We discussed who is Emily, what makes her tick, what's her vision for herself, what's our family vision for her. Those first few meetings provided us with a bank of ideas that provided opportunities in all these areas under brainstorming. We came up with age-appropriate, meaningful activities, as opposed to just time-filling activities, ways to become involved in the wider community, work experience, and building confidence. These were all strategies considered critical in increasing the number of natural relationships as opposed to paid in Emily's life, critical in developing valued social roles and really belonging in the community. This photo here is very relevant because we had discussed the importance of Emily getting work experience at 16, the same as any TY student. I had difficulty imagining my daughter in such a role. How could she help in a work situation? Someone else would actually have to do all the work. In any case, Emily needed to have work experience on her CV and she needed to try different things. We found a placement in an art workshop for toddlers in the National Art Gallery. Emily had to help put all the art materials together and also lead the group with a big sign around the gallery. The staff at National Art Gallery had made up a title badge for Emily. She was the education assistant for the workshops. She was introduced very professionally to the parents as the education assistant for the day. I was mesmerized how well parents immediately interacted with Emily and thanked her for her help and treated her with nothing but respect. It was the first time where I could see that Emily was perceived to have a valued role, and I saw firsthand how she was treated as an equal and not someone to pity. Being nonverbal was not a barrier to these parents. It was an eye-opener for me. How Emily was presented and where she was appeared immediately. It projected positive perceptions, and that was great learning for me. Emily's vision took about a year to develop after that first planning meeting. This was to be our guide for Emily. She wanted the same opportunities as everyone else, an inclusive life, to be valued in society, opportunities for further education, a rewarding job, a great social life, and independence. The outside bubbles represent what's important in Emily's life to achieve all these, and the next few photographs will highlight some of these areas. Before that, I need to explain the support that's required for Emily. Without the right supports in place, none of this vision can be executed. Emily needs 24-hour care 7 days a week. There are a team of 8 carers and nurses who spend about 18 hours per day in our home. Emily is very involved in the recruitment process and always chooses young, fun, can-do, energetic people with multiple talents. The team manage Emily's lifestyle, her personal care, and medical needs. They are fully trained in vision planning and communication with Emily. If this job interests you, please call me. Here are some examples of life sampling activities from our ideas bank. At this point in Emily's life, we wanted to expose her to as much as possible, so we could really explore where her interests lay. The first picture shows Emily attending sample lectures at UCD one summer. This was so important. We didn't know what subjects Emily could enjoy. Remember, education to date was minimal. We learned straight away that Emily would enjoy classes with plenty of visual stimulation and interaction. The more serious academic lectures were a non-runner. Emily and I then met with the project manager of UCD Access and Lifelong Learning Centre. They had super advice and were incredibly helpful and totally inclusive in their attitude and support. These steps helped set up Emily for a good college experience. Next picture shows Emily at her 18th birthday party. I had learned from our meetings that Emily had to have the best party, the best cocktails, the best music, the best band, the best dress, etc. She needed to look and act the part, to be perceived as a typical 18-year-old and to counter any stereotypical negative perceptions of people with disabilities. Emily had the time of her life, but to be honest, I'd never have done this if it hadn't been for the support circle and the advanced planning. Our lives are always too crazy and we tended to go with the flow day by day, but this was so worthwhile. Next picture shows Emily in the local pub on holidays in Kerry. It's very hard to get the wheelchair inside, but it's important Emily could hang out with her cousins and order her first drink. Before I really understood inclusiveness, I would have been less likely to even try and take Emily to the pub. And that was me leaving her out. Not good. Next picture shows Emily on a date with Thomas, her boyfriend. Hours were spent getting her hair ready, her nails done, picking out her clothes. This was something exciting to look forward to and a typical outing for a teenager. Next is Emily fundraising outside the local centre in Stepaside. Emily wanted to do a fundraiser for charity and she chose Barnardo's. It was incredibly successful as one of Emily's circle members, who's a neighbour, is also a local councillor. She told everyone about what Emily was doing and directed them to her table on their way in and out of the shop. Emily made €750 in 2 hours. Barnardo's were delighted with the result and wrote Emily a lovely thank you letter explaining exactly how her fundraising helped children in need. The story was also featured in the local area magazine and the owner of Centra gave us a lot of support for the day. Emily felt really good about that. She was giving back to society in a positive way. The last picture shows Emily modelling for Pennies in Nutgrove. This was something new to try and Emily had had her hair and makeup done. The stylist worked with her to choose clothes and Emily was interviewed on the catwalk. It was a fun experience for her. Street Fest. The Street Fest was one of the first ideas to come out of our circle meetings. It ticked so many boxes in terms of Emily moving into a valued role, bringing the community together and giving Emily the opportunity to host and manage an event from the beginning to the end. Emily designed the invitations, delivered them personally to each house, chose the decorations, the menu and the specialty cocktail. She collected the meat from the barbecue in the village, or for the barbecue from the butchers in the village, and he wouldn't take any money. And she invited a few neighbours to be on the Street Fest committee. Everyone was delighted to help, and the events, Emily did 2 Street Fests, were a huge success. There were 3-year-olds to 90-year-olds having a ball and staying out until very late. Emily received so many thank you cards, flowers and gifts after each event. The budget for each Street Fest was about €200. People were genuinely grateful, and of course, Emily was on a high for ages. Emily is looking forward to many more such events when society reopens again. Emily enjoyed summer work experience at the local garden centre. She had to prepare all the plants so they looked good for customers, and she learned a lot about gardening. It was a lot of hard work. She decided after that day she would enjoy gardening as a hobby, but definitely not as a career. Life after school. March 2020, schools closed. Emily finishes school forever. The panic initially set in as I gradually realized Emily would never be in school again. I felt I really needed that last term in school to organize her adult life. This was a bit of a nightmare. Emily was now home all day, every day with a blank calendar. I could barely cope with all the care involved in the hours Emily was home from school. Now we had an additional 8 hours per day at home without the matching carer hours. Gradually, though, we did get additional support from the HSE. Initially, we set up our own online school with friends, run by one of Emily's carers, who was a brilliant resource teacher. That provided a lovely outlet for the group. but thank God we already had Emily's vision and support team in place. We started to plan activities in line with the vision. It was hard to know what day of the week it was, so we developed a calendar every week. Emily did her own planning with the team for the following week. This provided a nice structure for Emily and for the team. We still do this. It was a positive outcome from lockdown. Planning is absolutely critical, as so much is involved with any activity for Emily. Without it, nothing meaningful happens for Emily. Despite lockdown, we were able to follow the vision for many activities. The next few slides will go through each of these areas. This is just an example of a weekly calendar. It includes the schedule for lectures, study time, Wellness Wednesday, where Emily does meditation or spa treatments, walks, showers, her tasting program, physio, blog planning. Lockdown became surprisingly busy. Under the goal for further education, Emily decided to try UCD. She chose one module, Art Deco and the Modern Aesthetic. We were advised initially to do one module only. That was just 1 day per week. This worked out perfectly and allowed Emily plenty of time to do research and follow-up reading. Emily loved the course and showed a lot of interest in the whole architecture side of Art Deco. There was so much opportunity now to develop this new interest. Art Deco, Bauhaus style buildings in Dublin to visit, lots of cool books, etc. Emily wanted to do more modules. The second module she chose was called Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. This was about famous jewelry houses. Emily was particularly interested in the history of Fabergé eggs and the Tutti Frutti range of Cartier jewelry. She was enjoying such a rich diversity of new subjects that were really enriching her life. Another module was called Breaking the Mold, an art appreciation course with the National Art Gallery. Emily is drawn to very select styles of art and has used the influence of Gustav Klimt to design her new blog. She also expressed interests in the history of developing maps around Ireland. I would never have guessed she would develop these interests. It wasn't ideal starting college on Zoom, but we made the most of it and it had its advantages. Emily got to experience college from the comfort of her own home. She got used to attending lectures without having to deal with all the new experiences of college life at once. Now she is ready for the whole experience. Lockdown provided us with a great opportunity to develop Emily's communication skills. We worked with an excellent speech and language therapist who found new ways to communicate with Emily. Her improvements were remarkable. Emily had never had the opportunity to work one-on-one as intensely before. The therapist has given us ways to allow Emily to initiate conversation with her signals, and Emily can now really share her opinions, her feelings, and needs very clearly. Emily has enjoyed these sessions so much and it has enhanced her life enormously. She's delighted with her newfound power. Our hope is to train as many people as possible to communicate this way with Emily. Emily also uses eye gaze communication to share information and command YouTube and Alexa. That's the photo you see here. These slides are examples of socialization and well-being. Once school ended in March 2020, there was no graduation ceremony for Emily. It was hard. So on our holidays in Kerry, we marked the occasion with a little socially distant outdoor party with her cousins, who also left school. There was great excitement and Emily wanted mojitos, crisps, and raspberry cheesecake for her party. When the party was nearly over, Emily's cousin Molly said she wanted to go for a swim in the sea. It was 8:30 p.m., pretty much Emily's bedtime. I asked Emily, would she like to go? And the smile on her face said it all. So down to the sea we went and everyone helped hoist Emily into the water. She had a ball and was thrilled to share the experience with her cousin. For years, we had stopped taking Emily into the sea. The wheelchair sinks in the sand, you can't bring a hoist down, and Emily is an adult, so it's very hard to lift her. But at one of the conferences I had attended by David Pittignac, I had learned how damaging it is to exclude our children from activities. The impact of being left out, even from small things in life, is like a punch in the nose in terms of pain. I asked him, would Emily not be used to just watching her cousin swim and her nearby in her wheelchair? He answered, maybe, but I guarantee you she'll live a much happier and healthier life if she swims with them. I'll never forget his reply. The bottom two slides show Emily enjoying nature walks on Wellness Wednesdays. Another lockdown positive. She really does appreciate nature, just like us all now. Lots of people said to me that Emily should do a blog, that she has a lot to say and share. Emily jumped at the idea and took the project very seriously. She wanted this to be professional. She wanted her own brand and wanted to design it. Lots of planning went into the project. Emily spent hours choosing different combinations of colors and fonts and other art influences. We then briefed a professional graphic designer in our back garden. She happens to be a neighbor and was delighted to help. Emily's speech and language therapist set up all the questionnaires for the blog, and Emily selected her own answers. This is a fun project for Emily, and it's exciting that she now has a platform to share her thoughts and opinions with others. A hobby. Emily decided she wanted to grow strawberries. She spent a lot of time researching the different varieties and soils required. Every day she assesses the soil and waters the plants. She hopes by next summer to have enough to sell at the local centre. Of course, she wants to design a brand logo too. All in all, leaving school has to date been a positive experience. I find the support in general very helpful, whether it's UCD staff, the local HSC therapists, neighbours, etc. And I'm extremely, extremely grateful to our own fab team at home, including Emily's physio and speech and language therapists, her support circle, and especially Rachel. I find the mindset in the adult world is more positive and wants to be more inclusive. We have greater freedom over Emily's life now, but greater responsibility too. The outcomes, however, make it all so worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Carol. We're getting really great feedback and questions from the panelists, and I think you can probably see them. Thanks so much for taking us through that powerful presentation. Carol, you won't mind me saying that you and I rehearsed a few times this week. We've had a few early morning Zooms, and I've seen and heard this presentation now, I think 4 times. And every time I've heard it, you tell a little bit more of the story. So what we're going to try and do now is pose the questions that people are asking in the chat and also in the Q&A. And just, if you're okay with that, just unpack a little bit more, because I think people's minds are going to be so expanded by the approach that you've taken. And I think the first thing I would say is that, you know, you've used an abundance mindset, Carol. And we heard you say at the beginning that, yes, there are real barriers to Emily's full accessing of community, but there's those external barriers, but there's also internal barriers. And I think that those are the barriers that you have largely addressed. So your mindset, I think you spoke about, and I'd love to ask you before we get into the questions a little bit more about that mindset and what kind of made that shift for you. Is that okay?
Sure. I was very surprised. I thought I had the right mindset. I thought I knew what an inclusive life was for my child. It wasn't until I started the workshops and the conferences that I realized I was actually leaving my own child out of activities. If we had people over to dinner and Emily was in the living room lying on a mat watching TV, I would say, "You're okay there, aren't you?" Because I'd be so worried about trying to get everything else organized. And I wasn't giving her the choice because of the hassle of hoisting her. And so you don't realize it, but you're doing it yourself. You're leaving her out of things unintentionally. And it does huge damage. And I saw it too as she was going through her school years, because Emily had a tracheostomy. She wasn't allowed to go to the village. If there wasn't a nurse available, she wasn't allowed to go swimming. There were an awful lot of things where Emily was thrown into another classroom or left out. And that conference really, really upset me to think I was missing out on so many things with Emily. So the mindset takes a while to change, to actually realize what we apply to our own lives. It's just such common sense to apply the same to our children with disabilities. And that requires a lot of reinforcement. So you need constant reinforcements. The earlier you start on these kind of conferences and workshops, the better. A combination of education and empowerment with the workshops and conferences. Really gradually then you start to adapt a more inclusive life, and then it starts to become more natural, and there's no turning back after that.
That's amazing, Carol. So, just in terms of it becoming more natural, I'm really interested in that. And I think one of the things that we often talk about in LEAP with families is kind of being confronted with our own freedom to be, I suppose, explorers of the abundance in our community. And I know for some people, it's very easy to be cynical and to laugh at that, or just to ignore that and say, well, that's all very nice. But I think what I'm hearing from you every time I hear the presentation is that you began to look in another direction. You had to be focused for so long on the activities of daily living, to use that language, that needed to be done every day to support your daughter to get up, have her breakfast, get dressed, stay healthy in her body. All of those activities. I've been to your home many, many times, Carol. And, the first time I came, it was confronting for me, to use that word again, to see how many hours were taken up with Emily's support needs, and how in that process, it's not surprising that the other stuff, the pieces that make up the good life, took a second place at times. So first of all, what I would say to you is that the system, I think, and I'm a parent myself, those of you who know me, my eldest son has a disability, is now 27, living a good life, I hope, an inclusive life. It's a journey, it's not a destination. Has himself some individualized funding that supports him to work, to go to college part-time, to live independently. But for me also, when my son was a young boy, not yet an adult, a teenager, I began that journey that you've described of attending these workshops. It was like that. It was almost accidental. I bumped into somebody, she invited me to something, and then, we began that journey of just attending events, meeting other families, and learning and reading and seeing stories of people, families living good lives in the community. And we began to sort of unpack or unlearn some of the knowledge that you pick up when you're attending all these appointments with your children, the clinical, the medical, the therapeutic appointments that take so much time, depending on your child's disability, that you stop thinking about the other stuff that our other children, if we have them, take for granted, the membership of clubs and groups, the presence in community, going to the neighborhood school, having friends, having regular birthday parties. You know, your focus gets drawn away from that by the realities of supporting your growing child. So I suppose what you have reminded us is that there are great riches in community, but you need to focus on those. You need to bring your attention back. Obviously, in Emily's life, her whole life, the therapies, the supports, the clinical piece is going to be critical to her actual survival. And then for her flourishing, there's a whole other piece. So I have two questions, but I'm going to save those till the end. We've kind of talked about these questions just to draw out some of the learning for people. But let's have a look at the questions coming in from some of the audience here today. So we've got a question from Lucy Harrington. And Lucy says, I'm interested in how you approached setting up a circle of support. So Carol, you might want to answer that if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, Lucy. It was really thanks to Rachel. She kept at me, now is the time to set up your circle of support. After I had done the research, after I had learned that there were other options for a good life for Emily. I think while in the school system and the service system, during Emily's teenage years, you never actually think, you don't realize there are other options. And once you realize there are other options, you know you can't go it alone. You do need help. So Rachel kept encouraging me to set up a circle of support. And she said, this circle should just include people who you know that love and care for Emily. That's all that matters. So we have a couple of Emily's cousins who are close to her age. I have a sister, we have a neighbor, we have Rachel, and sometimes we have other people and people who are important in Emily's life that actually want to be involved and contribute. So even just to ask people for help was daunting for me, to actually say, can you come to our house and help us with Emily's life and not be paid for it? So, and Rachel had to keep saying to me, Carol, these people want to help you. It's not a chore for them. They're delighted to help. So I took her advice, and that's how we set up the group. And I don't know if you can see here, but I have a book here that has all the information from every single meeting that we've had. So if you look at the very first planning meeting, for example,
we can't see it, Carol.
Okay,
sorry.
I can just quickly talk through it. The very first planning meeting, there were ground rules set, you know, that this is a free space, you know, let's not get stuck in the how, nothing is impossible. Emily's future is an open book. And then we moved on to expectations for the planning session. To have a vision for Emily. We wanted to address Emily's isolation, which was something we had highlighted before, particularly at weekends, evenings, and holidays. We wanted to begin to move from time-filling activities to valued roles. We wanted to think more broadly about the future. We wanted to identify others who should be part of future planning. And we wanted to get excited about life after school and explore the idea of convening a support network. And then we started all brainstorming, who is Emily? And everybody gave their input. She's a 16-year-old young woman. She's a lovely sense of humor. She's bubbly, she's sociable, she's loving, she's a beloved daughter, etc., etc. And we started to get a feel for Emily's whole personality from the group. Then we moved on to what's happening in Emily's life now. School Monday to Friday, attends Laura Lynn Respite, member of a Rebels and Friends group, family holidays in Kerry, visits from cousins, attends regular clinical appointments. And then we moved on to Emily's vision for herself. We knew she wanted to be mixing with people, to have fun, to live with or near family, to enjoy regular routine, you know, et cetera, lots of opportunities to socialize. She wanted to have her own car, her own independence. So then we got our vision for Emily, which was to have a purpose, not be sitting at home, to be a valued member of her extended family, to have high expectations for Emily, not to be bound by current expectations for people like Emily. This was huge. I mean, to think like right now, I know Emily has options for a career that are actually her own work. She loves designing. She loves designing invitations. She loves designing her blog. She has a real set ideas of what she does like, what kind of script she wanted for her blog. So, you know, with her eye gaze and with her communication, that's a real role that she can excel at. All our children have talents that we have to discover. And that's what it was just so brilliant about this whole process. So then it goes from vision to goals, and you set goals after each planning meeting and you keep moving forward. And then I have a few meetings where we did tons of brainstorming, like summer holidays, how to deal with that, ways for Emily to be involved in the wider community, building confidence strategies, employment ideas, who do we know, what contacts do we have, who can help get work, etc. So that is the nuts and bolts of the circle. It's everything for planning for a future. It really is.
Thanks, Carol. That's a really, really wonderful insight. And you and I were talking this morning about using ordinary means to achieve ordinary ends. And where you talk about work experience there, the example that I would give is that for our other children perhaps without disabilities, we use ordinary means to gain work experience, don't we? And what I mean by that is, if we're looking for work experience for our young person, our teenager who's in transition year, what do we do? Typically, we ask our circle, our network. I don't mean our circle of support. I just mean our friends, our neighbors, our community, our family members, and perhaps one of them has a business or works in a business that lines up nicely with our son or daughter's interests. So what we say again, you know, this idea of confronting you with your own freedom. And I absolutely went through this process myself, that, you know, we just say to you, use the means that you use for your other children to gain work experience for your son or daughter with a disability. And, you know, there's absolutely no judgment here, because for those of us whose children went to special schools, there is no expectation that our children will get work experience. We know that because there's no guidance counselling. There is very little work experience done in many special schools to date. Now, that is something that is being focused on and hopefully will change in the next few years. So it's not surprising that we don't think to do this, because there is no support to do it. And that's the other thing I think that came through really clearly, Carol, in your presentation, and is very much one of the reasons for setting up a circle of support. Families need support in order to achieve realize high expectations rather for their sons and daughters, brothers or sisters. So that's really important. I'm going to have a look at the other questions now and see what we have here. So Helena, hi Helena. Helena Tierney, I think we've two Helenas on the call today. What kind of communication system does Emily use? Asks Helena.
Hi, Helena. Emily uses, I think, what's called auditory scanning as a new communication tool. For years, we were just giving Emily options to her eyes with our fists. We would say, Emily, do you want to go to the movies or do you want to stay at home? And Emily would look to whichever choice she wanted. But it was very limited, and it was very, I guess, a long process if you were giving her several choices, because you could only give two options at one time. So this year, when we got our speech and language therapist to work with Emily during lockdown, she used auditory scanning. She observed Emily and said, look, Emily, I'm going to give you some options to answer a question, and you're going to give me a signal, any signal you want, with your body, with your face, with your hands, however you want. She observed Emily, over several months, but Emily was very quick to give her signals very clearly. So Emily might just look with her eyes, or she might blink, or she might just smile, or she would just make a movement with her head. Or if she was very tired, she would just use her fingers and she would move those. So the important thing is to have her body very quiet and relaxed, which is a big challenge. Before we start asking a question, we tell her what the options are for an answer before we ask for her answer. And then we say, please signal which option you want. And we started with the book, a format that everybody could learn, that we actually don't need to use now because Emily is so familiar with the auditory scanning technique. And the book might say, okay, Emily, do you want a quick chat? Do you need help? Let's talk about categories. I want something, feelings. And if Emily said she needed help, we'd go to page 3, and under page 3, there would be 4 options. Whether it's she needed a nebulizer, she needed to change her position, whatever she needed. And Emily got to know those 4 options would always be asked in that order. And so she became very quick to give her signal for whatever she needed. So we worked at that for a while, and then gradually we don't need the book because we just say, okay, Emily, we're going to give you 4 options. What do you want to talk about today? And so Emily is given options to initiate conversation. Like there's different subjects under categories, for example. Go to page 5. Emily knows that she can talk about people, activities, places, or her body. So people and activities give her great room to say, okay, I want to talk about my dad, or I want to talk about my friends, or, it really lets her initiate that conversation, which we never had before. And I can sit on the sofa now, and Emily's in her wheelchair. I don't have to be up in front of her face saying, do you want to do this or this? I can say, Emily, you have a choice now. Do you want to watch Netflix, listen to a book, or do something else? And she can give me a signal from across the room. And that's just fabulous for me. And I just feel it's given us some time to prepare Emily for going to college, that there will be a better system for everybody to communicate with her. And she's very quick now at making her answers, and she's very proud of it. She knows she can get what she wants. So it's given her a lot of confidence.
Thanks, Carol. That's marvelous. And I was just thinking while you were talking about the process that we call life sampling, and how you have really immersed Emily in life sampling, even during the pandemic, and how extraordinary it has been for those of us who know your family to see Emily grow her interests and show us, the rich interior life that she has as a young woman, as you say, interested in historical maps, Bauhaus, Gustav Klimt. Who knew, leaving school, that this young woman had such a rich cultural interest? And her blog, her blog is absolutely the pure class. I can't think of another phrase. I mean, it looks absolutely so professional. The design is just second to none. And this is all coming from Emily. And I think you told me at one point, Carol, that from a very young age in the States, you exposed Emily to art classes. I wonder, would you talk about that story a little bit, please?
Emily was in a university at the time where she had a fabulous professor teaching her, and about 3 other children, and all with disabilities. And what was happening in America at the time was everybody was going mainstream. And the other 3 left, and Emily was in the university by herself with these fabulous professors teaching her. And I just didn't know what to do. I thought, gosh, do I want to send Emily to mainstream? Because I had heard about some of her pals who went and ended up very depressed because they weren't able to keep up and it didn't work out. But I needed to know where Emily stood in all of this. So I enrolled her in a regular art appreciation class with just typical 4-year-olds. There was nobody with any disability in the class. And I just wanted to see how she got on. Of course, the first few days that she was there, none of the children listened to a word the teacher said because they were just all staring at Emily. So the teacher was very good. She said, do any of you have any questions you'd like to ask Emily's mum about Emily? And once they got that out of the way, yeah, she was accepted and everything was perfect. But Emily became extremely frustrated because we had to do things like draw the Mona Lisa or whatever. And she had serious temper tantrums. I'd never seen her behave so badly, actually. And I'd have to take her out of the class. But when we came back in and I'm trying to help Emily draw the Mona Lisa, Emily would do a lot better than I would, I can tell you. But the teacher actually got very cross with me. She said, I don't care if Emily does a dot or a splodge. You can support her hand with the paintbrush, but the work must be hers. There's no such thing as bad art. And so we did a lot of Jackson Pollock type art then. And, you know, I kept meaning to frame it because it was so beautiful anyway, but it gave me some insight that, yeah, Emily was frustrated that she couldn't do with her hands what the class was being told to do. So, and there was some other art they were doing where they had to get tissue paper and tear it because some artist, I can't remember his name, had problems with his hands as he grew older and couldn't paint anymore. So he did all his pictures with collage of paperwork. And she asked Emily to tear the paper into different pieces. And I went, Emily can't do that. And she goes, well, I'll just give her half of it. I'll put it in her hands and we'll pull together and see if she can. And sure enough, Emily pulled it and ripped the paper into pieces. So I learned then to never say never about your child, because it's very wrong to have it in your head what your child can't do, what she might like for the future. I don't have a right to make those decisions. And I was always surprised by what other people could teach me. And anyway, it was just that's it, Rachel.
I think it's so interesting if I can just unpack that a little bit. So, you know, a lot of us might like sport, but we might not be very good footballers, for example. So there's a few things in there. Emily clearly loves art. She also can make art in harnessing technology more and more. She's clearly showing us that she has an interest in art in terms of learning about it as in the role of student, but also making it in the role of designer for her blog, which has now also gone live. And she's really clear in the blog that these are her own thoughts, her own ideas, how to communicate with her, give her time, don't ask her too many options, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I think that's so interesting that she was exposed to art from a young age. And yes, there were frustrations for her, but at the same time, that clearly was and has become a lifelong interest for her. So one of the things that you've heard me say many times, Carol, is let's notice what makes our sons and daughters' eyes dance in their head, and to always notice when she comes alive, when she's leaning in, when she is obviously rapt with attention, and to follow that interest and to find where there are other people in the community who also share that interest. And then to have Emily show up in that place in valued ways. And that's what you were talking about with the 18th birthday party, that, you know, in order for our disabled family members to be accepted, unfortunately, we need to bend over backwards, and we need to make sure that we protect their image, their reputation, have them show up in valued settings, and so on and so forth. And this is something for those of you who get a taste or a little bit of interest in what Leap are talking about and what you've heard from Carol today. We regularly run webinars, workshops, events We have a series of brochures we're developing at the moment that goes into our whole approach to supporting families to assist their family member with a disability to live an inclusive life, an ordinary life, a good life. And that is absolutely for any family at all, whether your child is currently in special school, mainstream school, whether your young person has recently left school. We work with families up until the middle 20s. We would like to work with families right through the life course, but we're a very small organization. We have 1.5 staff and a very active board. So that's just to say that for those of you who are new to LEAP and you're here today joining us for the first time, you know, we connect with families on work like this, both in group events, but also on a one-to-one. So please get in touch if you're interested in this approach and this way of working. So there's a bunch of questions and comments here, Carol. You're going to be exhausted. So Siobhan says, Siobhan Keane, just a comment from Siobhan, really inspirational. Thanks so much for sharing the journey. I know that there are a number of parents of children who attended school with Emily, which is marvelous. Deirdre Fitzgerald says, inspiring presentation, really demonstrates the importance of a truly inclusive life. Thank you. Kathy Sweetman, great webinar, Carol. Great to see Emily loving life. And Patricia Murphy has a question. Hi, Patricia, this is excellent. Thanks, Carol. I'm really interested in how you explored Emily's vision for herself and what she would like to do. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Patricia. What would you tell us there, Carol?
Well, I think it goes back to that first meeting where we said, who is Emily? What makes her eyes tick? And also we looked at what a good life would look like. We looked at what a good day would look like for Emily. For example, you know, we started with the general things in a good life. You know, love, independence, friends, family, own home, fun, holidays, spirituality, exercise, nature, happiness, social occasions. These are all things that are in anybody's good life. They're not things you get in a service. They're things that are actually free. And, you know, we looked at what would a good life look like for Emily, given we know what her interests, we know what her personality is like. We know she's bubbly, she's sociable. We know she enjoys movies. We know she enjoys fashion. We know she's very affectionate. We know she loves being out and about and she likes time to relax. And we know she enjoys her physio because she loves functional movement. So we took all of these and sort of said, well, how would we put that into a day? What would it look like? And, you know, we sort of planned out a bit of time to kind of address all of those areas. And, you know, Emily has made it very clear she'd love to travel. Now, we have not, that's a big challenge for us, and we haven't addressed it, obviously, in lockdown, but also I can't actually get Emily on an airplane, but we can, there's lots of things we can do with travel where she can independently travel even to different cities around Ireland, and maybe we can get a ferry eventually. But the rest of them have all come from her. You know, she loves to go to shopping for clothes, so that became her personal shopping. You know, we were all the time getting her toothpaste and toiletries and stuff, but Emily's an adult now. She needs to go into her bathroom, see what she needs, write a list, and go off with her carers and do her shopping. Very simple, but something that we hadn't actually given her the independence to do until it was brought up, you know, and also she does it locally so that she's seen by the neighborhood and everybody knows her now going into the shop. So it ticks a couple of boxes. It's her independence and it's also her being seen regularly in the community. Other areas, she's always shown an interest in learning. Emily has. She loves stimulation, and so she knew she wanted to do further education, but she didn't know what in, and I didn't know what in. I knew she loved music, and I asked her, I said, would you like to study about music, and she said, absolutely no way. She loved music, but didn't want to study music. So the sample lectures at UCD were so important because, as I said, one lecture was on introduction to philosophy and how to be happy in life, but it was very academic. It was talking about Pavlov's dog and the hierarchy of needs. And Emily wouldn't understand any of those words because she'd never been exposed to them before. So she totally said, get me out of here. Didn't want to be in that lecture. And then the other lecture was about the museum in UCD, about all the artifacts in the museum. And it was fabulous because the curator was showing us beautiful old objects and the history about them and explaining the pictures of art on the objects. And there was interaction and there was visual stimulation, and Emily loved it. So, you know, we knew she needed further education. And then we worked closely with UCD and we explained what Emily liked and didn't like. And they narrowed down the list of courses that might be suitable for her. We went through all the different contents, and then Emily chose the courses herself, actually. And so I don't know if I've answered your question there.
No, that's great, Carol. That's great. We've so many questions, so I'm going to try and get through some more with you. There's a number of questions, Carol, asking about funding. And I think that I have to say, before we get into those, that, you know, the order in which we think about this as parents is really, really important. So if we just focus on the money, we're still stuck in the mindset that we can buy a good life for our son or daughter. We actually can't, because what we need to do is to focus on their belonging, their relationships, and their valued social roles, and money won't actually purchase those. So we need to think about the vision first. We need to think about who is in community and where do the things in the vision happen in community, and how can we connect our son or daughter, brother or sister into that energy, into that action. At that point is the place to think about paid support, because if we start with the paid support, we get stuck on needs, and that's almost a whole webinar in itself. So we need to sort of inverse it and think about, as I say, start with an idea of the abundance in community, really work on our mindset and try and unlearn some of that thinking that says our son or daughter, our family member can't do X, Y, and Z, and begin to think about rather their gifts, their talents, their interests, and their contribution, and what may make a meaningful life for them, what may make a good life, where they can make a contribution. After that, we move from contribution to presence. So presence with a C. I'm talking about how can we know that any of us belong in community, and it's by the fact that we're missed. People might say, oh, where's Carol this week? Carol's here every week. Where's Carol? She's not here. We can't start without Carol. That's kind of the yardstick, isn't it? That we know that we're belonging, you know, if we're missed. So we coach families to have their son or daughter, brother or sister show up reliably, regularly, at the right time, with the right equipment in ordinary community life. Okay, so, you know, you don't turn up at the garden centre in your swimsuit, you know, you turn up at the garden centre ready to do gardening with your wellies and a trowel and an anorak, because it's usually raining because we're in Ireland. Now, that's the piece that is really sometimes quite head-wrecking, to use that phrase, for families. How do I match what my family member can do with the options in community? But I think the thing that we heard from Carol today is that, you know, if you look at things differently, all sorts of energies appear. And if you can accept that people want to come into your son or daughter, brother or sister's life because it meets some of their needs too, that this is about hospitality, it's about reciprocity, it's about people wanting to show up. I love coming to Emily's circle meetings. I get to hang out with a really great group of people, most of them a lot younger than me. It's very positive. We share stories of success, and most of all, we see Emily moving forward in life in ways that just amaze us. So, you know, accept and trust and believe that is true for your family member. And for Carol, starting the circle of support was a bit of a nightmare, but now it's just a group of people getting together and talking and brainstorming and thinking through problems and issues and so on. And there are other people on this webinar today that have gone through that journey, and many more who are at the precipice of doing that, who are at the edge of doing that. So I'm not saying this is easy, and I want you, Carol, to talk a little bit about that, because at one point in the presentation, you talked about how there wasn't an adult service available for your daughter. So in many ways, you had no choice but to go on this journey. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please? And about the support that Emily needs, how many hours a day and what that looks like, please.
Well, we had tried to approach the HSE. I tried to give them 3 years notice, saying, look, Emily's coming up through the system. These are her needs. You know, I knew the services didn't have like nursing on site, for example. And so I wanted to engage in the process very early on. But, you know, I was just advised in a letter that I had to wait my turn, and they would review Emily's needs when she left school. And if there was a placement, they would consider one. So that scared me. And, you know, at that point, I wasn't aware of other options. That was when I was really stuck until I got involved in the conferences. I remember being at a lunch break in the first conference, and somebody said to me, forget about services, don't go down that route. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? I have no choice. I really didn't know about just following a normative, typical path with its challenges that we all have in life. So yes, it's harder. It is definitely harder, but if I had not gone down this road and waited until the HSE said to me, sorry, we don't have a service for you, your daughter's needs are too complex, I just, nothing would be worse than that. All the work, yes, it's much harder, but we have control over Emily. Emily has control over how she chooses to live her life. No one else has the right to choose for her, you know, and the supports have to be tailored to give her that independence. The alternative of no life just wasn't an option. It would have been much harder for us to sit and watch Emily. Emily needs stimulation, and she just zones out if she doesn't have it. And that would have just been, it would have been hell. And I can imagine it's hell for a lot of people, you know, who end up sadly in that position. And I don't know what's going to happen next year or the year after. I just know I'm on a path that Emily's enjoying and that's challenging and fulfilling for her. And that each little step that we take opens up new opportunities that I never imagined, you know, in terms of work experience or people willing to help. Just through your own connections, you become braver as you go down this path. You start drawing people in to help, you know.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. There's a lot of questions about personal budgets. So could you just tell us the type of funding that you currently receive as a family, and speak a little bit about the option of personal budgets?
Well, Emily's kind of a bit of a tricky one, because she had a budget for her home care from when she was very young. And so that's part of the child package that she had. And then she became an adult and got some hours with that. And now she's a school leaver. So it's a mixture of 3 budgets, which is taking time to kind of bring into one personalized budget. But really it is 100% for her care. That's the big issue, is having Emily's. She needs one person with her 100% of the time and 2 people with her a lot of the time. Especially to have a life of independence, she needs to go out. Like if she goes out somewhere, she needs to have 2 people, one to drive and one to attend to her needs. If she has an asthma attack, for example, she has to have a nebulizer given to her straight away. So the budget, the personalized budget, the whole idea behind that is it would give you some certainty that you could plan around, that you know for sure isn't going to be pulled from you as soon as a new disability manager comes in and starts trying to say, well, you should have less hours or you're not allowed to get these hours. That is absolutely terrifying as a parent. You just don't know where you stand, especially when people within the HSE change and the new person comes in and they start trying to tick boxes that weren't ticked, and they say, okay, you can't have hours on a bank holiday anymore because they're too expensive. And I kind of have to say, well, Emily's needs are the same on a bank holiday as a non-bank holiday, but it's a battle. And so if you have a personalized budget, you know how many hours that can buy, and you can try and manage it in a cost efficient way, you know, where you're not going through a service that would charge a huge, I guess, markup on those hours. You could hire self-employed people through a platform, or you can, I don't know, hire self-employed people directly. So once you have that budget, then you can pretty much look at the big picture and manage, set out a plan for the whole year in terms of
Carol. Yeah, absolutely. And for all the people asking about personal budgets, and I know there are people here who are accessing the personalized budgets demonstration project, because we're still at that project point with personal budgets in this country. LEAP are running a webinar in June on personal budgets. Look, it's been very slow. The rollout was just, or the pilot was just starting when the coronavirus hit. So it's been very, very slow progress, but there are individuals still in this country who have had, or also who have had personal budgets or individualized funding for a number of years. My own son and us as a family managed to secure a personal budget for him leaving school. But what I would say, and it's not what people want to hear, but those of you who were on Margaret and Jeremy Ward's webinar with us recently, you know, their daughter, who sadly died a number of years ago, Mina, they had a personal budget. It's far more common in Australia, but it was nowhere near enough to provide paid support for all the hours that Mina required paid support because of her physical and her other support needs. So, you know, this option of individualized funding leads to self-direction work for the family. To, you know, what are we getting this funding to do? There isn't a service provider who arranges a schedule. There isn't a service provider who provides a building. So if you're thinking about going that route of a personal budget, you know, it's you, it's your community, and then it's the paid support that you can buy in with that budget. So it's a very different approach. And luckily now we have families in this country who can, if you like, show their experience and are further ahead of us on the path, and can actually say, look, this is what's worked for us. This is what's, you know, you need to think about. This is what's important to focus on. But let me say really clearly, and I know Carol will agree, you're never going to have enough funding, because what is enough funding anyway? And actually, if you focus on the funding, you're almost putting the responsibility on the money to create a good life. And, you know, I suppose I've seen over the years, I've done this work, people who have millions of euro in terms of individualized funding, people in the system, I'm talking about in the service system, whose funding costs an enormous amount of money, and that funding is used because they have developed a reputation as challenging and so on and so forth. They need 2 staff with them all the time, and the funding goes into providing an incredibly restricted, institutionalized life for them. So Actually, sometimes what I'm trying to say is more funding doesn't equal a better life. It can equal a more impoverished life in terms of quality of life. So we've tons more questions now. I'm going to say to people that for the questions we don't get Carol to answer today, we will try and follow up with you and give answers in email correspondence. If you don't get an email and you have a burning question after the webinar today, please get in contact with us and I will forward any questions for Carol to Carol. So our email is leapireland@gmail.com, and you can email any questions that aren't answered today. So I'm just going to go through a few more comments and questions. So Kira Campbell, hi Kira, is asking about the circle. Has the membership of the circle changed over time? Helena is asking, did you have a positive experience regarding accessing an individualized budget for Emily? And Helena also says, brilliant presentation, has given us parents some great insights in how to create a bright, supported future for our young adults. How often do the circle meet? Any suggestions on encouraging a more positive attitude in mainstream secondary school? My daughter is 13, has Down syndrome. That's from Lucy. Lucy, we also have another webinar next month on inclusive education. You may like to join that. That isn't something that we're going to be able to address today, I'm afraid. But in terms of the circle then, Carol, how often does the circle meet and has the membership of the circle changed?
I'd just like to say one thing to Lucy first, if that's okay. Just to remember that school is only a small part of your child's whole life. It was a nightmare for me, those school years. Absolute battles, obstacles, very isolating. I found it really, really tough. But now I don't look back and I'm just looking forward. And from the last few years in school, I started to look at what I could control. Where could I put my energy into positive things, as opposed to it being drained with the negative stuff, because the negative stuff kills you in the end. But so big picture now, I've forgotten about school. That's not right. I know it needs to be addressed and it needs to be changed, but just try not to think you're going to change everything and right all the wrongs, and put your energy into other things that you know you can control in your child's life. That's all I just wanted to say. So in terms of the circle, sorry, Rachel, which was the question?
Yeah, there were two parts to the question. It was how often does the circle meet and has the circle membership changed over time?
Okay. I probably should have it more regular than it is. Like, you know, we lost a lot of time in lockdown. We didn't think of having one on Zoom for a while. It was nearly a year actually when we started again back in February this year. Almost a year went by, but we went through, like, I don't know, I'd say about 4 to 6 meetings or 6 to 8 meetings a year. I could try and do it within every 2 months. Again, it was daunting for me, and I felt if I'd had a meeting, I felt guilty asking somebody to turn up again for another meeting every 6 weeks. And you have to you've got to get over that. And even if sometimes the meetings were just, I'd come away from them with my head exploding. I was overwhelmed with all the ideas and all the stuff we have to do, and how am I going to make that happen, and how am I going to get my daughter work experience. But when you write it down and you break it down and you have someone like Rachel pushing you with such passion, and you take that step, the next step happens a little easier. And then when you see something like Emily in the art gallery or in the garden centre and feeling really good, it's just so worth it. And as I say, it becomes a path then that gains momentum. The group, the majority of the group are still the same, but we have had people who've come on out of their own interest, who sort of said, look, I'd love to be in the group for, it might be one meeting they might come for, it might be a couple of meetings, some people might dip in and out. I believe it's a really good open space, and anybody that wants to be there, I'm really happy to have them there. Sometimes people who come into the group have no idea what's going on, and they look at it from a totally different perspective, and I think that's very healthy too, because they see challenges that we may not see, being so close to it. So I think the goal over time would be to have more and more people that are near Emily's age. You know, the idea is that, you know, if something happens, Edward and myself, that her cousins and people who know her really well in her own age group will be running the group. Will be able to continue this, and it'll be people who know Emily inside out and know what kind of life she wants, and she will be totally comfortable with them. Emily is a lot more comfortable with the group now. She's quite interactive in the meetings, and she's at every meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Okay, well, we've 5 minutes left. We're still getting questions coming into the Q&A and chat box, which is remarkable. And I'd just like to apologize again that we won't get to them all today. I have a question here that I think summarizes really some of the learning perhaps for families today. And it is this, Carol, and you and I have talked about this question. So looking back over Emily's life, what do you think are the two most important things that would make it easier for disabled people and their families to create good lives for themselves?
Well, I think I have it in, I think maybe two parts, that answer. Services and supports are critical, but it has to be of the family's choice. I think it needs to be independent. So if a service can't dictate which physio you need to go to, for example. You know, Emily was born with a brain injury, so she needed a physio that was specially trained in neurodevelopment techniques. It's called NDT or BOBAth. You know, when you go to a service, you're not given a choice, and there's very few physios trained in that in Ireland, but that was what Emily needed. So she should have the choice. So if she's allowed 12 sessions of physio a year, she should be able to have that support or service or whatever therapy or whatever it is of her own choice. That's critical, I think. You can't have it forced on you in a direction that doesn't match your daughter's needs or your son's needs. So services and supports, education and empowerment with the workshops and conferences, that has to start really early on. You know, as I say, people need to know there are options for a good life. You don't need to just resign yourself to, oh, well, my child's going to go to an adult day service. Now, this is my opinion only, and I'm only speaking for Emily and myself and Edward. You know, there are plenty of people out there who are happy with the service, and their children are happy in the service. So, you know, everybody has to do their own research and decide what's best for themselves. But the education and empowerment part of that, I think, which is critical, which I found really, I was so lost not having it, was like a formal multidisciplinary transition planning, like a legal process, where your child from the age of 13 is involved with the services, where you start discussing how you're transitioning from teenager to adulthood. I remember from the States that by law that had to be in place by the age of 16. Whereas here there is no transition planning, and I think that produces huge anxiety in the children. You know, not like, I've gone to some events where children who've left school have spoken out, and they just, the anxiety they had, not having ever known anything but going to their service, their day school, never went to anywhere else but Enable Ireland. They just got the bus to Enable Ireland every day, had never had any other experience, had been nowhere else, and now they don't know what's for them in the future. And some of them who were verbal were able to explain that, but the non-verbal kids, you know, the anxiety levels went through the roof. And can you imagine that for yourself, not knowing anything about your future or who's going to take responsibility for it and how can you have a say in it? So I think that process is key. You need a multidisciplinary approach. You know, like Emily's respite stopped at age 18. You just fall off a cliff. It's like, bye now, you know, no more respite. So, you know, we can't go away on holidays unless Emily can have 24-hour coverage by 4 people within that 24 hours at least. Even the personal budget is purely for care once you get it. It's not for any therapies. It's not for any speech and language therapy or communication devices, or, you know, we have, as I said, 8 nurses and carers coming in here every week. I have to provide tea, coffee, milk, paper towels, toilet paper, all the cleansing stuff for, I mean, with the infection control at the moment is huge, and it's huge cost to us. And there's no budget for that. And I, you know, when I say this to the HSC, they're like, that's so far down their list. They're like, okay, let's get the care sorted. And that is the most important thing. But, you know, neither of us are working. We are 24 hours at home with Emily every day. So we do need to keep fighting for other stuff like therapies, like respite. But that's why I think a formal process, you know, if this country could just put that in place, it would make it a lot easier for the services, because they would have dealt with it in a timely manner, as opposed to everybody ready to leave school with no plans or no placements.
Thanks, Carol. So just to summarize then, and to end today's webinar, and to thank Carol wholeheartedly from all of us to you for sharing your family and Emily's story. And please thank Emily for the beautiful photographs today.
I will do.
So just to summarize then, what you're saying is important is person and family centered supports and services that are individualized around the person, clear transition planning for children with disabilities from ideally age 13, workshops, events, the opportunity to connect with other families who are perhaps further down the road, and to think about the good life and inclusion, to think beyond therapies, care needs, the whole clinical piece if it's necessary for your child. So I think that's really been so helpful today. And thank you so much, Carol Lloyd. Thank you to all our participants today. And we will be endeavoring to answer your questions. Just a couple of comments from people for you, Carol, as we leave today. Thanks so much to Carolyn Leap from John Daly. It's great to see lots of dads on the call today. Oh, sorry, that's from Joan Daly. I beg your pardon, Joan. Beg your pardon. So there are lots of dads on the call today, and we know a number of them. Yeah, huge numbers of thank you messages here. Patricia says, really enjoyed that. So informative and helpful. Thank you, Carol. Too many to mention, and we better go because it's already gone 12:30. So again, thank you so much, everybody, and look out for further webinars from LEAP in the coming months. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye, all.